Hello everyone and welcome to Puzzle Busters, Java Challenges Solved. Boy, have I got a challenge for you. The name of today's challenge is Paycheck Calculator, and the object of the challenge is given a number of hours, calculate the total amount of pay, including accounting for overtime worked. And now, if you want to take a moment to pause the video and visualize how you think you might do this, go ahead. And if you're ready, let's talk through this together. So imagine that we start with an array of hours that we'll call hour sets. And we're going to loop through the array and grab each set of hours one by one and run them through a calculator. And that calculator is going to return a value that we will then pass through a display function to display to the screen. So we'll need to start with a couple of variables, including a wage rate, an overtime rate, and we'll need to have a couple of empty variables called total pay and overtime that we'll use in our calculator function. We'll also need to have an integer that we will use to iterate through the loop and also use as an index placeholder for the array. And so using a for loop, we can grab each set of hours from the array. We can then run them through the calculator function. That calculator function will return a variable that we will in turn pass through the display function. And in the calculator function that we're going to write, we're going to start with an empty total pay variable and an empty overtime variable. We're going to run the math, which will involve trimming off any hours that we will consider to be overtime. So we'll say any hours over 40. We will then multiply the remaining hours by the wage rate, and we're going to add those numbers to the overtime hours multiplied against the wage rate, which will in turn be multiplied against the overtime rate. Then we're going to return that value to be displayed to the screen. And we'll also use a neat little table to set it up to make it readable. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Starting with our Eclipse, we're going to have a class called Paycheck Calculator, and we'll have our main method. Now outside the main method, we're going to define our static variables because we need them to be accessible to all the functions. So we'll have a static double array that we're going to call our set, and we'll set that equal to a set of different various hours. So we'll say 28 hours, 33, let's do 22, 45, 14, and 50. That should be good. Now, next we're going to need to come up with our wage rate and our overtime rate. So let's do a couple more static doubles that we'll call wage rate, and let's give them a wage of $15 an hour. And then the overtime rate will also be a double, and we're going to make that 1.5 for time and a half. Next we'll make our empty containers, so we'll have a double called total pay. We're not going to assign it. Then we're going to have another double called overtime, and we're also not going to assign that. Next we will define our iterator. We'll call this one I, and we'll make it an integer. And then we're ready to get to work. So inside the main method, let's go ahead and set our I equal to 0 and begin to loop through the set of hours one by one using a for loop. So for each double that we're going to call hour, we'll call them hours. In the array that we've called hour set, do the following, which will be, let's name the display function display paycheck. So we're going to display paycheck, and it's going to accept a value, and that value is going to come from our calculator function. And since the calculator function is actually going to return a value, we can actually evaluate it. So we'll pass the calculator function itself through to the display paycheck function, like so. We'll say calculate pay is the name of the function, and that function is also going to accept a value which we will be passing through the hours worked. And so we do this correctly, it should actually work. Then we will iterate our I variable, and that should execute for each number of hours in the set of hours. Alright, so that's everything in the main function. Let's go ahead and write our two other functions, the display paycheck and the calculate pay function. So we'll start with the calculate pay function. This will be a public static. It's going to return a double because that's what's going to get passed through to the display. Calculate pay. It's also going to accept a double that's going to be called, we'll call it total hours. And in this calculator, we're going to need to we're going to need to assign our total pay equal to 0 because every time it loops through, we want it to start over. and we're going to assign our overtime to 0. Then using an if function, we need to check for overtime. So we'll say if total hours is greater than 40, that's usually what people consider to be overtime, we're going to perform the following. And that is going to be, we're going to set our overtime equal to the total hours minus 40. And that should make sense. And if it's not, then nothing will happen there. Then we're going to set our total pay equal to, and then here's where the math comes in. We'll say total hours minus the overtime. And if there is no overtime, it's just going to be minus 0, so then nothing will change. And we're going to multiply that against the wage rate. Then we're going to need to add that to a second calculation here, which will be any potential overtime multiplied by the wage rate again, multiplied by the overtime rate. And again, if there is no overtime, then this will all equate to 0 and nothing will change. So if we did everything correctly, that should work. And then we're going to return that value. So we'll return the total pay, which will then itself be passed through the display paycheck function. And so everything there looks correct. So we should be able to write our display function. So we'll do a public static, I think we're going to call it, it's actually going to be a void function. It's going to actually perform something but not return anything. So that's a public static void display paycheck. And it's going to accept a double value that we're going to call total amount. And it will perform the following. So let's do a print line function with nothing in it, just for formatting purposes, to sort of give a space between each time it iterates. Let's then check to see if there's any overtime, because I want the table to look different if there's overtime. So if the overtime is greater than 0, then we want it to separate the table headers into regular hours and overtime hours. And we will concatenate the index value in hours set equal to whichever iteration we're on. So we'll do I, and then minus the overtime, because those are going to be displayed separately. And then right under that, we will print out the overtime and concatenate the total amount of overtime there. So that looks about right. Let's see. So now if there is no overtime, then we simply want it to print out total hours. And so we'll do an else clause and print out to the system total hours. And to that we will concatenate the location in our array equal to the iteration. We'll close off that else statement. And in all cases, we will print out the total amount of pay. So that'll be paycheck, and we will concatenate total amount, like so. All right. Everything there looks good so far. I don't think that I have any errors, so if we did that correctly, we should get a nice, oh, look at this, overtimer. That's not right. Let's fix that real quick. All right, everything here looks clean. I don't see any errors. This one's not recognizing. Why isn't that recognizing? Ah, we forgot the concatenation. All right, so now everything looks good. Let's go ahead and run it and see if we got this right. All right, perfect. So we have our table headers here. Total hours of 28 will give us $420. Total hours of 33 gives us $495. Total hours of 22 gives us 330 hours. Over here we have some overtime, so it changed the headers to regular hours of 40 and overtime hours of 5, which gives us a paycheck of $712.50. Right here we have total hours of 14, which gives us $210. And right here we have the regular hours of 40 with the overtime hours of 10, giving us a hefty paycheck of $825. And so you see, we were able to make this happen. I would call this challenge busted. And now, an additional challenge for you. What small change in code could you make to also account for income tax? Let's say an income tax of 12%, and then display that in a similar header in the table. So that's a little one to have fun with at home. Otherwise, I hope this was informative and entertaining, and I look forward to seeing everyone back in the next video. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful night.